Thank you so much. It is really a great pleasure and honor to be here. I'm delighted to be back in Colombo with some old friends and with a lot of people whom I respect greatly. So thank you for inviting me. The topic that we were given is challenges for women in the global south. And honestly, it has never felt more appropriate because of all challenging times, I think right now is one of the most challenging. And the typical reaction, I think, pretty much across the world and certainly in Sri Lanka, is one of shock, horror, and almost like desperation. What do we do now? And in a sense, bracing for terrible things to come. And that's true. We can see that there is clearly going to be massive disruptions of global trade. We know that there's going to be a global recession. We know that that is going to impact developing countries the worst. And we know that the countries that are already debt-stressed, that already have lots of concerns about how they're going to repay debt, generate enough foreign exchange for essential imports and all of that, are going to face the most problems. And we know what that means internally. We know that that means that essential public spending will get squeezed, that import prices will rise, and therefore the prices of all kinds of essentials, and then other things like transport, utilities, etc., will all rise. And all of these impact women much more disproportionately than men in the many ways that all of you know. So I'm not going to repeat. I think we've had some excellent introductions already from Shakuntala and Sumangala, and you already know the problems. I can tell from this audience that I don't have to tell you about these issues. But I'm going to put it to you slightly differently, that maybe we should not just be shocked, horrified, and depressed by what's happening, but see this not just as a wake-up call, but really as a way to tell us that now there is no alternative but to change. So you know how we were always told that there is no alternative from the standard neoliberal policies, that that's what you have to do because that's what all countries do. If you want to develop, if you want to proceed, that's what you have to do. We now know that that doesn't work. We knew that it doesn't work because we've experienced that it doesn't work, but now we know that that's actually not happening. In other words, the rules of the game, which were used in a way to tell us that this is how economic policy must be conducted, those rules have been blown up by the very powers that created the rules, actually. And it's a free-for-all right now. Now, yes, free-for-alls are scary, they're terrifying, but they are also opportunities to rethink. And that's why it is so important to have this conference now, because as we've seen, the patterns of growth and development that we have experienced, certainly in South Asia, but in many parts of the developing world, over the past if we And this is an opportunity. Why? Because none of the other stuff will work. We cannot go back. Growth basket, basically saying that, we're not going to worry about raising wages because the point is to have lower wages to be more competitive with Myanmar or Cambodia or some other country. Instead of doing that, we can actually think of doing something else. So I believe that this is actually, yes, a terrifying moment, but also a moment in which we can genuinely rethink, first of all, what we want from an economy. Secondly, what are the kinds of policies, institutions, legal processes that will get us there? The regulatory processes that will get us to that. And therefore, what should our focus be? So, this is just one particular fundamental rethinking of how we approach the economy. Completely imbued in the other way. I'm sure all of you, we've all had to deal with policymakers who really can't think of it in any other way except how people and workers and women contribute to the economy. And the contribution is only valued in monetary terms. And the idea that the economy has to work for society, for human rights, for preserving the planet, etc., yeah, fine. You keep that for the last session, You don't keep it for your actual policy making. We have to actually be able to persuade people that no, the economy is there to serve people and planet, and we therefore demand, in this crisis, a very, very different response. So what are the elements of that kind of response? Let's think of it first of all in terms of what are the major things that contribute to the quality of life. Okay? So of course, in basic quality of life, there are some essentials. Obviously, food, housing, access to health, etc. Right? We know all that. And we know that those kinds of spending are not those that necessarily the market will deliver to everyone and to all. And those have to not just be preserved, but enlarged. That is, you have to have more public spending on those. The same IMF that comes and tells countries like Sri Lanka and a bunch of other countries that because it's a crisis you have to cut spending. That same IMF is very well aware of this. If you look at their own research work on what they call gender and economics, or if you look at their policy recommendations for a country like the US, they will say in a downturn you have to spend more. And you have to spend more where the multipliers are greater, which is in fact in things like the essential services, the care economy. So they are aware of this. It's time for us to push this, that in a downswing we have to be spending more, not less. Everyone is kind of taking it as inevitable, we have to spend less. No, we have to spend more. Okay, that's one aspect of it. The second part of it is that, we have to recognize that all the formal economies in the world, in every country, are basically, floating on a sea of unpaid work. And that unpaid work dominantly carried out within homes, but also communities. Dominantly in care work, in care activities, but not only in care activities, and a whole range of activities also related to agriculture, to small-scale industrialization, other kinds of services, etc. That unpaid work is really what that flimsy layer of the top formal economy is riding on. And that sector is, as already talked about, I think Sumangala also mentioned it, is the one that is not just unrecognized, but it's, in fact, I won't even say it's unrecognized. I used to think policies are gender blind. It's not gender blind, they are gender exploitative. It's because policymakers know that that work will continue to get done, no matter what. Whether at the cost of people's time, women's time, or the depletion of their energy and resources, it will get done. And it's that knowledge that that work will keep getting done that allows policymakers and the capitalist economy to exploit it. But that is the one that actually has to be strengthened, preserved, and reduced. You know, the famous R's of the 5 R's of how to reform the care economy. They are, first of all, recognize all of the work that is done, especially the unpaid work. Secondly, to redistribute a lot of that work. Thirdly, to reduce a lot of that work. So if you have to walk miles to fetch water or fuel wood, or you have to spend hours in looking after someone, nursing, because the public nursing facilities have been reduced, are simply unavailable, and so on, those have to be reduced. Fourthly, you have to reward those who are actually going to give the paid care work, because we do not reward them properly, as you know. And it's not just nursing, it's not just the entire range of other care work, but because so much of this work is done for free. Markets don't reward them, employers don't reward them, public sector doesn't reward them properly. So we have to reward all of the care workers. And finally, we have to actually give them a voice. We have to allow them to represent themselves in policy making as well. And that includes paid and unpaid workers. So all of that, yes, a major focus on that in the middle of a crisis, I repeat, not afterwards once the growth has happened. That's what we're always told. We have to do this after okay, once the economy is growing, then
you will look at your care workers. No, it has to be done now in the midst of the crisis, because this is also a means of regenerating the economy along that different path that I mentioned, not the path that just sees the crisis and then how you respond to it in a kind of patchwork band-aid, but on a different trajectory. The third thing is to actually then focus on the viability of the most essential production. So what are the most essential types of production? Certainly the care work, but also food, right? Also agriculture. And I know in India, I know actually in all of South Asia, that we have really, really neglected the interests of cultivators. And again, we put burden after burden on them, even in the good times. And of course, in the bad times, they face it immediately, whether it's incredibly high electricity prices faced by farmers in Punjab, or it is the unbearable fuel price increases that impact irrigation possibilities in both Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh, or it is the entire range of not just policy apathy, but really cynical approach to farmers and the attempt to commercialize agriculture that we have seen in India. We see that it's almost a miracle that viable small-scale cultivation persists. And also, we are not creating the incentives for that small-scale cultivation to move in a more sustainable direction, to get food systems that are not ecologically disastrous and unhealthy and so on. We have to actually think of all the things that are needed by cultivators within our economies to make them shift to sustainable forms of farming that are viable, financially viable, like any other kind of economic activity. And those can be done. There are lots of people who have been thinking about these issues. We know that women farmers in particular are completely neglected by this. But we really do have to push that too in the midst of a crisis. Once again, I repeat, it's not something to be done after the crisis. It's a crisis response. Why? Because that is another means for that economy to regenerate, to revive, to recover from the shock. I'm not saying you have to forget about exports. Obviously, you need exports to continue importing and so on. But clearly, the entire focus of an economic trajectory that is based on export-led growth means that you are doing everything possible to remain so-called competitive vis-a-vis other partner countries. But that, in turn, means that you are really thinking of wages only as a cost, not as a source of effective demand, not as a source of a domestic market, not as a means for decent employment conditions. And so women, plantation workers, women in the garments industries, etc., they are not the ones who benefited from the previous boom. They have already, in Sri Lanka, had years of crisis to deal with, really, ever since, last 5 years, let's say, of severe crisis.
And yet now they will be expected to take on additional burdens. The purpose must be to protect. Immediately you will get a response from the neoliberal policy, among the policymakers, that, oh, well, we can't do that because that will make us higher priced, and right now we just have to generate whatever export income is possible. Now, again, this is where a more imaginative approach that says we are going to control inessential imports, the luxury imports of the very rich. I've seen a lot of it. In India, we have one of the biggest markets for luxury cars in the world today, which can be afforded by 0.0001% of our population. That's the kind of thing you could say, well, let's control those imports. Let's control illicit financial flows, which are huge, certainly here, but pretty much across South Asia. They are huge. Let's control those, and there are ways we know of controlling them. We do have country-by-country reporting, banks exchanging information about where, in fact, money is flowing and the transactions that are occurring. We can use that to actually reduce both multinational and domestic illicit financial flows that prevent governments from raising the revenues they need. So let's say we curb the inessential imports. We focus our imports on the things that enable our people to thrive and our essential producers to thrive. Essential producers in agriculture, in basic services, in care work, etc. And then we see how enabling them to thrive generates what Hyman Minsky used to call a bubbling up of the economy. So you know how we're constantly told about trickle down? That you give the rich some money and they're going to go out and invest and they'll create growth and that will trickle down to the rest of us? That doesn't work, right? We know that, no, they don't trickle down, they move on, they collect it and stash it abroad somewhere and live very excellent lives and so on. Bubbling up is the idea that if you actually put incomes and purchasing power in the hands of those who are likely to spend it the most, which is, of course, the relatively poor and the women who have not had access to incomes before, that bubbling up generates demand. And it gives you a huge multiplier effect, and it allows that economy to expand in a sustainable way on its own steam. So in a way, the fact that the earlier trajectory has now been smashed up, it's terrible. It's a huge shock, I do recognize. But from that shock, we can take the recognition that we have no choice but to move to another trajectory. And if there is that choice, then this is the moment to have that other trajectory available. I do believe that a feminist perspective that recognizes the significance of unpaid work, but also the significance of all of these other types of labor market segmentation that come about because of that unpaid work, because women end up doing a lot of that reproductive work and the care work, and then are very differentially placed in labor markets and in asset markets and in pretty much everything else. Once we recognize rectifying that is actually a way out of the current mess. It's not, that we're just saying this because we want to be nice to women. We are saying this as an economic trajectory that is a viable way out of this current massive crisis. Okay, let me stop here because I think I've already gone on too long, but thank you very much for listening.